Well, hello, everybody. Um, Tonight we have a very, very special treat. I hope that some people have gotten to experience this tour in real life. But Biff, Biff, how many times have you done this tour? You're muted, Biff. You got to unmute yourself.
Around 100.
Around
Can
100.
you hear me?
So, yeah, we can hear you now. So, I've put together a little slideshow, and Biff is going to basically walk us through this tour that Eruch would take pilgrims on, and then also, it's filled with Baba stories, of course. So, it'll be recorded, so it's always on YouTube, and I'm so happy about that. But anyway, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen so we can see this. Okay, everybody can see that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, can I get, yeah, okay, perfect. And I
That's
just
good.
gotta make sure that it's spotlighted because I don't know how to do that. Betty, do you know how to do that? Spotlight my screen. Oh, thank you.
I got
Okay,
him.
cool.
I got him, Margie.
Thank you, Peter. Hi, Peter.
You're welcome.
Okay, so hi. All right, Biff. So I'm gonna press play and then I'm gonna give it to you to take away. I mean, if you want to say anything before you get started, go for it. The floor is yours.
Well, sending love to Michelle and Marvin and thinking of them often here at Meherabad. So we can
Okay.
start.
Okay. All right. So virtual tour of Baba sites with Bif Soper.
Okay, so you're gonna pause it there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
All right. It's all. Go ahead, Biff.
I was always impressed with how the Mandali, who had many of their own situations to deal with and tasks and responsibilities, would spend time with us sharing their experiences with Baba. And for many years, Eruch would take people, pilgrims, on a tour of the Laura Caves, the Valley of the Saints. And he included stories from the new life because Baba and the four remaining companions traveled through the Valley of the Saints and spent time in Aurangabad before coming back to Meherabad. So Eruch would include those stories. And so I felt justified in when after Eruch did it for many years, then Gary Kleiner took over, and I think he reached 150 times taking people to these places. But I eventually filled in and am still doing it. Last November, I think it was November, I took Margie, Izzy, and Ellie from England there. And last week I took 4 women also on the tour. Yesenia is a Baba lover, and she lives in the Raleigh-Durham area. So when we go on the tour, I want to include this information that after the pilgrim season in the late 70s, I think it was, Eruch, Falu, Balnatu, and Dara went on the tour with Eruch. And Dara had good recording equipment that he had brought or had been donated by Peter Townsend. And Eruch took them on the tour, and Dara made a recording of the whole tour. So most of the stories that I tell are based on those stories that were recorded by Dara. And I think the way we're going to go on the tour today is the way that we would journey there. So it's not historically consecutive necessarily, but it works. So the first stop is the Imampur Mosque, which is about 9 miles from Meherabad, and it's on the Aurangabad road. And Eruch says that at the end of the new life, they were wandering down that road in the evening. And Baba very casually points over in a field and says, "Oh, look, there's an old ruin of a mosque there. Maybe we can spend the night there." And that Eruch, of course, says, "Why not?" So the four companions, who were Eruch, Baidul, Gustaji, and Pendu, they went into the mosque, and on their hands and knees, they were checking to make sure there are no snakes or scorpions, so that Baba would have a safe place to rest for the night. And the only light they had was they'd have to strike a match, because they didn't even have flashlights, or as they're known around here, torches. And so when they inspected the whole room, then they put down a rough shepherd's blanket in a corner for Baba to rest for the night. And in those days, I went there with Eruch once, and he showed us. And there was, it's not there anymore, but there was a flat patio area in front of the mosque. And so the three men lay down to sleep there outside. And Eruch was on watch. And after a time, he heard a clap. So if you can imagine, he had to go into the darkness of the mosque and stand before Baba and strike a match. And then, as long as there was light from the matchstick, he had to read Baba's gestures. So I imagine it was quite difficult to do all that. And Baba's gesturing, "Those men, they're snoring, they're disturbing me, make them go further away." So Eruch had to go outside and wake up the men, and they had to go out by a tree by the road and sleep out there. And then after a time, Eruch heard another clap. So he did the same thing, struck a match, and did his best to read Baba's gestures. And Baba's saying to him, "There's something inside this room that's disturbing me." And Eruch said he stood there in the dark for several minutes to just hear what it was. And finally, he heard the rustling of a bird that was nesting with its brood. And so he goes back to Baba and tells Baba, "Baba, there's a bird nesting inside here." Baba says, "Throw the bird out." And this is during the new life. So one of the orders of the new life was any order, good, bad, or extraordinary, had to be carried out immediately. So without any thought, Eruch went in the darkness and is feeling and listening. And he's finding where the nest of the bird is. And he's just about to do what Baba asked him to do. And he hears this other kind of a clap, which is very insistent, which means drop everything and come to me. So he returns to Baba and strikes another match. And Baba asks, "Did you throw the bird out?" And Eruch replies, "I was about to, but you clapped and I had to come." And Baba says, "Why didn't you remind me? One of the tenets of the new life is to do no harm to any of God's living creatures. Why didn't you remind me?" If you had thrown the bird out, it would have poured water, which means ruined the whole of the new life, which at that point had been going on for more than 2 years. And then after that, Baba says, all right, good that you didn't throw the bird out. Otherwise, the whole new life would have been spoiled. But okay, now just forget about it. But in the morning, remind me about what happened here. And when I was there with Eruch, he showed us this little walled area outside the mosque again, and it was for bathing. So early in the morning, they had drawn water from the well, and Baba was in this enclosure, and Eruch was with him, helping him bathe. Baba was in his undershorts, and it was a small enclosure. And Baba says, "Now call the men." So the men stood inside this tight space, and Baba says, "Now tell them what happened last night." So Eruch tells the whole story, and Baba again emphasizes, if Eruch had thrown the bird out, it would have ruined the whole new life. And now Baba takes responsibility for what happened, and he says, because I almost did such a great sin, I want you to take off your sandals and beat me. And Baba didn't mean little love taps. He wanted them to hit him hard. So they obeyed. That was the order that he had given. And so they beat him with their sandals, which in India, to beat someone with your sandals is one of the greatest insults also. So they beat him until his skin was pink and stinging, and then stopped. And Baba says, "Oh, I feel so relieved now. But to crown it off, I want you to spit on my face." So again, they had to obey his order, and they spat on his face. And Baba says, "Oh, now I feel completely relieved. Come on, let's hit the road," is the way Eruch described it on the tape. And so I have to keep drinking a little bit to keep going. It's just a Tulsi tea. And so they started walking. And during the new life, I remember Money and Eruch both saying it was so difficult. It was stressful in so many ways, mentally, physically, etc. And yet in the midst of it all, there was this incredible sense of freedom. Because every morning you wake up the companion of God, and he was your companion in the new life. And you never knew what he was going to do next. You were just following along and seeing what would happen next. So they were walking down the road towards Ahmednagar, and they didn't know if they just keep walking past through Ahmednagar, because when Baba had left on the new life, he said to people, "You'll never see me again." And he gave no indications that it would ever end. But they came to the junction on the Aurangabad road where you turn off to go to Meherabad. And from that place, you can see Seclusion Hill. And if Margie would go forward and show the cabins on the hill, Seclusion Hill. Yeah. So very innocently, they're down on the road and looking up at the Seclusion Hill. And Baba says, "Oh, look, Eruch, those cabins are still there. Do you think we can go there?" And again, Eruch says, "Well, why not?" So they walked through the backside, through the fields. And Baba sent a message that Money and Mera could come out into the field and greet him. And I remember Meru said that the order was so strict that everyone else had to turn their backs away from Seclusion Hill so they didn't catch sight of Baba. And so they came out there, and there's a beautiful video of Mera taken by Erwin and Eddie Luck. And in those days, seclusion here was just desolate. It's just dry grass and rocks. And you have this black and white video of Mara standing out there, remembering this time. And so you have the most beautiful woman in the world in this desolate landscape, and only focused on her beloved and talking about how beautiful he is in the video. So Mara and Mani and Baba, they chit-chatted and went over what had been happening in the last several months. And then Baba said, now I have to do this Mananash work up on the hill in the cabin. And I want you to send tea and food and practical things like that. But then they got to watch Baba walk up the hill with his hair flowing and wearing his sadra. And it was such a beautiful image for me watching Mara describe that in the video. And so this was the end of the work of the new life. And I think I need to talk a little bit about Mananash. And so the Mananash, Baba had different phases during the new life. There was the begging phase, the Langoti phase, the gypsy phase. And at the very end, there was the Mananash phase, which I'm sure you all know means annihilation of the mind. As Baba says, the only way you can experience who you really who you really are, is to annihilate this mind that keeps reminding you that you're not that. That your mind keeps telling you you're this little person that has a name and a country and different experiences in one lifetime. And Baba says, that's not who you really are. You are really God. And to experience who you really are, you have to annihilate the mind. And so when Baba began the work of Mananash, he was in Hyderabad, and he had these 5 models carved, small models carved out of stone, representing 5 major religions. And you can see them in the museum at Meherabad. And at that time, they found a cave, and Baba, just like when he described how to find Myrtle Beach Center, he gave certain hints of where they should look and what should be there to find this cave. And they eventually found this beautiful cave up on a hill outside of Hyderabad. And it's now known as the Mananash Cave. So they put the models inside the Mananash Cave, and Baba did his work of Mananash facing these models. And when Jeff was helping Bao write the New Life book, he said to me, that I had an interest in visiting Baba's places around India. So he said, if you have photographs we can use for the book, that would be great, of the locations where Baba had been. And so with Jeff's financial help, I went to Hyderabad and hired a car, and for 4 days I traveled the end of the New Life route and went to as many places as I could and took photographs to be included in the book. And what I noticed was on that journey, Baba had gone to the Samadhi of a Sufi saint in Gulbarga, Bandinavas. And he had gone to it, he was a kutub, he was a perfect master, not a saint. And he'd also gone to a Hindu perfect master's Dargah, and he had gone to a Sikh's perfect master's Dargah. And later in the Valley of the Saints, he also went to the Dargahs of perfect masters. And it made me think that one of the impressions that has the greatest hold on our minds is people's identification with their religion. And also in the cave, he had the models of the 5 religions. So it was a big part of the Mananash was to annihilate those impressions that so many people in the world cling on to. And so anyway, he was up on the hill, in Seclusion Hill, in the cabin, but it was in wintertime and the men were just camping out on top, and it was very cold and there was some strong winds, and Baba never liked the wind. And they couldn't even hear his clap when he clapped. So Baba said, this isn't working out. So he called Padre from Meherabad, and he told Padre, I want you to take apart these two buildings and reassemble them in Meherabad, which is what Padre did. And the room that we know as Eruch's room now was that room that Baba used for the Monash work. But so Baba was working there. He worked in the blue bus. He worked in the room across from that Eruch's room that Pendo had used. But he left them in on the hill out in the cold. And he said, you're my link. So they got to be up there. And I think it was the 31st of January, and the men had apparently had come down to lower to Meherabad. Baba tells Eruch, write on a scrap of paper all rights and religions of all the world, all rights and religions of the world are consumed in the flame, something like that. So Eruch writes this down, all rituals and rites of the world religions are consumed in the flames. And Baba takes the scrap of paper and puts it in his pocket, coat pocket. And he tells Eruch, now call the Min Mandali from Ahmednagar and Meherabad to be here this evening. So the men were really happy to be able to see Baba again after 2 years, more than 2 years. And Eruch said they built a little pit for a fire, a Duni fire. So they all stood around the fire. I mean, I assume they sat around the fire. And at some point, Baba stands up and takes out the scrap of paper and tears it into pieces and throws it into the flames. And then later, when the fire had cooled down enough, Baba, with his own hands, he gathered the ash from this Duni fire, and he filled 2 big oil drums, you know, the tins that they have vegetable oil in. He filled 2 of them with this ash from the Duni fire and had it sealed, soldered shut. And he said, these should never be disturbed. And basically at that time, the east room on Meherabad Hill in the compound was Mera's room, but it also stored all of the, you could call it archives of Baba. So he had the ashes taken there. And I remember Mani telling us that once or twice a year, Baba would send her and Naja to the east room to check on everything, to make sure the mice and other things weren't ruining what was being stored there. And Mani, who had a curious side to her, she lifted these tins and she said, for just being filled with ash, they were incredibly heavy. So I think I'm debating whether to tell another story that's related to Imampur.
Your stories are great, Beth. So, I mean, it's up to you.
Okay, then with your encouragement, I'll tell this other additional story that's related. We might not finish the whole tour today. But the story is that Eruch would tell that this is happening during the time of Shivaji, who, I mean, there's so much you can say about him. Which I won't. because that's not the subject matter so much, but to give the atmosphere of the time, Shivaji was born in the mid 1600s, and he was eventually a warrior king that was fighting against the rule of the Mughals, who had been ruling India for hundreds of years. And the head emperor or sultan was in Delhi. And then there were little kingdoms in the south. Ahmednagar was one of them that paid tribute to the sultanate up in Delhi. And there was one of the sultans, or I call him emperor, what earlier was called Shah Jahan, and he's the one that constructed the Taj Mahal as a tribute to his wife that he loved very much, one of his many wives. And he had 4 sons, and one of the sons' name was Aurangzeb. So when Shah Jahan was ruling and spending all the wealth of the kingdom on this monument to his dead wife, Aurangzeb was down here in this part of India, living the life of a fakir, means almost penniless, and just praying and devoting his life to Allah. So he was very devout and sincere Muslim, and he was very upset with his father for wasting the wealth of the kingdom on a monument to his dead wife, which, by the way, so many millions of people appreciate now. And so Aurangzeb managed to, he was the youngest of 4 sons, so he did away with this 3 older brothers somehow, and then imprisoned his father, Shah Jahan, and he became the emperor in Delhi. And Shivaji was down here causing trouble in this part of India because he was standing up for the rights of the Hindus. And Shah Jahan sent down his best generals to try to defeat Shivaji, and Shivaji was very clever. And he trained all the local farmers how to ride horses and attack these big, cumbersome armies in the jungles. So that was one of the first uses of guerrilla warfare at that time. So back to Shah Jahan. So he was such a believer in Islam that he built the biggest mosque in the world at that time. And he was very proud of his achievement. And so he ordered that everyone had to go inside his mosque and pray. And one day he asked the imams, "Is everyone going in my mosque and praying?" And they said, "Yes, Your Highness." Everyone except one old man, he refuses. So the emperor Aurangzeb says, "Then carry him in and make him pray." So they did that. And so everyone's praying inside the mosque, and the old man stands up and shouts at the top of his voice, "Your God is at my feet." And when the emperor heard about that, he was so outraged that he said, "Cut off his head," which they did. And then days later, Aurangzeb's mind became very disturbed, and he was restless, and he couldn't eat. I mean, he would try to eat rice, and it would look like maggots were crawling on his plate. And he'd never had an experience like that before. So he tried to figure out, why is it that I'm having so many disturbing experiences? So he went back to the mosque and he asked the imam, "Tell me honestly, there'll be no repercussions. Tell me honestly, what were you thinking?" And the Imam said, "Oh, Your Highness, I was thinking I wanted to impress you because my daughter is of a marriageable age, and I wanted you to give me a boon so that I could afford to marry my daughter." So the Aurangzeb ordered, "Lift the stone where that old man was standing." And according to the story, there was a bag filled with gold. And the old man had stood up and pointed down and said, "Your God is at my feet." And so Aurangzeb realized that this was a very saintly soul that he had beheaded and that he had committed a great sin. And so because he was very cruel in the way he practiced his religion, but he was very sincere. So to atone for his sins, he said, "When I die, I want you to dismember my body and bury it in the places of the saints." So it happened that I'm going back now to the time of Shivaji, and then after Shivaji, Shivaji's son, Sambhaji. And Aurangzeb was so frustrated by the Marathas' rebellion because at one point Shivaji, he had captured like 190 forts all over Maharashtra, and he crowned himself king. And Aurangzeb was outraged. So, and his generals just couldn't do anything. So Aurangzeb himself came here on the Deccan with an army of 100,000 with cannons and elephants and camels and horses and all the paraphernalia of war. And he spent 30 years trying to defeat the Marathas and failed. And he died here in Ahmednagar. So to carry out his wish of atonement for the great sin that he had committed, they had to take his body and carry it, in those days, by wagon. And of course, there was an entourage, and they were taking it to the Valley of the Saints, where he wanted his body parts buried. And going by wagon, the first night where they stopped was where this mosque is. And so I remember telling this story to Meru, and she made the connection, the story of the bird, and Baba had to atone for his sins. And then here's this emperor who's atoning for his sins. And somehow Meru made a connection there. So I found that very interesting. All right. So I think we could go on to Toka.
Okay. Let's go to Toka. We're on a rickshaw. Here we are.
Well, we usually go by car, not by rickshaw.
Yeah, we'll pretend that we're going by rickshaw.
Okay, so in 1928, when Meherabad was flourishing, and there were 500 here living, and they had schools for hundreds of children. That was all free. And they had a hospital, and the Mandali and their families were living here. And it was a very busy atmosphere. And all of a sudden, Baba says in June of 1928, or May, he says, "I want to move Meherabad." And I always had heard that it was because there was only one well to provide water for all these people. And the summer had been very hot and dry, and the rains weren't coming. But I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. I've heard other versions too. Anyway, Baba wanted to move Meherabad to Toka, which is less than an hour's drive on the Aurangabad road. Yeah, there's the Godavari River. So it's called it Toka Sangam. And Sangam is where two rivers join. And in the confluence of those two rivers, the tradition is considered holy by the Hindus. And they say that the divine river, the Saraswati, comes and joins the two rivers as they merge. And the Godavari is in the south, this part of India, it's considered the sacred river, just like the Ganges. And that, you know, the Kumbh Mela, which is the biggest Hindu religious gathering that happens every 3 years in 4 different locations around India. One of the Kumbh Melas happens in Nasik because this river, the Godavari, flows through Nasik, which is upriver from Toka. And if you follow the Godavari to the source, there's a place beyond Nasik, about 17 miles higher up in the hills, called Trimbak. And then you climb to over the top of the mountain, and on the other side there's a spring, which is the source of the Godavari River. And Baba had, when he was in Nasik, he had hiked up there one time. And then he established Toka, his Meherabad on the Godavari River in 1928. And later when he went to Andhra, because the Godavari crosses India and empties into the Bay of Bengal. So when he was in Andhra, he actually stayed on a houseboat on the Godavari. So he was at the source, the middle, and the end point of the Godavari River. So he really sanctified it. So in 1928, the whole 500 had to move to the banks of the Godavari River, and they made these temporary shelters, rooms where they use this bamboo matting they called tata, and constructed places for people to live while they were there. And also the Prem Ashram was part of the schoolboys that came to be there with Baba on the banks of the Godavari. And he also brought his table cabin, you know, the one that's next to the Jopri in Lower Meherabad, where Baba had spent time writing the book. So they brought the table cabin, they raised Baba's 7-colored flag, and Baba called it Meherabad. And many things happened there. And one of the things that happened was Meredith Starr from England, his fiance and his sister were given permission to come and be there with Baba in Toka. So they were living there. And one of the stories I find humorous is that Meredith Starr was, and Baba, you know, was planning his trips to the West, which would happen a few years later in 31. And so Meredith was there with his sister and his fiance. And he loved to meditate. So he would put a sign on the door of his room, and he'd say, the sign would say, "Please do not disturb meditating." And Baba one time came there, knocked on the door, and nobody responded, and looked at the sign that said, "Please do not disturb meditating," and Baba left. And I found it very humorous that what's the point of meditating? You know, God's at your door. you're not interested in opening it because you're meditating. And is Ferris Day, is she listening? Can I interrupt for a second?
Yes, I'm here.
So Iraj's father's name is Iraj from Seattle. His father's name is
Odayar.
Hodiyar. Hodayar. Okay, thank you. So Hodiyar was the youngest member of the Prem Ashram. He was 8 years old. And when he was about 80, he and his son Eruch were at Meherabad, and I talked him into going to Toka and showing me the place. And so we went there, and in those days there was no bridge. So you had to take a boat across the rivers to get to where Baba stayed, where Meherabad was on the Godavari River. And there's an ancient temple, which Margie, I suppose you could show the temple now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a temple there in the confluence of the Parvara River and the Godavari. And up the bank from the temple, about 200 yards on the left side, is where Baba established Meherabad. And the temple had ghats, which are steps down to the river, to the Godavari. And so Eruch's father told me, he said, well, Baba wanted us to learn to swim. So he had the Mandali teaching them swimming, and then they would go to those ghats where the steps were down to the water, and they would be taught swimming there. And he's a little 8-year-old boy, and he's paddling away, and he looks up, and Baba's very quickly walking on the bank, and the light catches Baba's hair, and it's like golden hair. And he said it was an image he's never forgotten. You know, after more than 70 years, he had this clear image of the beauty of that moment with Baba. And what else about? I remember in the tape, the recording of Eruch, he talked about in that place, because Baba was really good at uprooting them from whatever they were used to. So he said, in our life with Baba, there's no attachment to anything, place, or person. And that's what part of Baba's spiritual training with them. And I think it continues today also.
Should we go to the next?
Yes, let's go on. So the
Okay.
Christian cemetery, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the order in which, when we're traveling from Meherabad, we come next to what's called the Christian cemetery. And
Biff, how far is it? How long of a drive?
Well, to get all the way to the caves, if you don't stop along the way, it takes about 2 hours and 45 minutes from Meherabad. And the Christian cemetery is at the point where if you kept going straight, in a few kilometers, you'd be in Aurangabad. You turn off to the left to go up to the caves. And then just a short way down the road, you come to this Christian cemetery where Eruch would stop and tell a story. So that's where we are now, in the Christian cemetery. And previous to the story of the Christian cemetery, Eruch and Baba and the 4 companions had also been in a guest house in Aurangabad itself. And one day, Baba said, Eruch, I want you to find a venerable old priest to bless me. So Eruch and Baba got in a Tonga, and they were going all over Aurangabad. And Eruch is supposed to find a venerable old priest. And they weren't having any luck finding one. And finally, the Tonga driver pipes up and says, well, sir, what are you looking for? And Eruch says, they only refer to Baba as their elder brother. My elder brother wants to be blessed by a venerable old priest. And the driver said, I could have saved you some trouble because there's a retirement home for old priests. I'll take you there. And so Eruch, or the Tonga, goes to the place, and Eruch gets down and knocks on the door. And Eruch said he looked like he was European, maybe Austrian, and had white hair, this priest that came to the door. And Eruch knew that this was the one that Baba was looking for. And so Eruch turns, he asked the priest, would you be willing to bless my elder brother? And the priest said, certainly, I'll do that. And so Eruch is turning around to bring Baba. Baba's already getting down. So Baba kneels before the priest, and the priest blessed him. And then Baba gets up and goes back to the Tonga. And the priest turns to Eruch and says, oh, my son, do you want me to bless you too? And Eruch says, no, I don't have time. And he goes to be with Baba. So back to the Christian cemetery. So one day Baba brought them to this cemetery, and amazingly, in the middle of the cemetery, there's a shrine to a Muslim saint. And I just imagine that, people in India that are spiritually advanced usually have a place that they like where they spend a lot of time and just sit there. So I imagine this saint liked the atmosphere of this Christian cemetery, and then when he died, his followers erected a shrine to him that's still there now. And so Baba brought them there. So you have in the middle of a Christian cemetery a Muslim saint, and they put his rough blanket at the border of the wall of the Muslim saint, and where all the Christians are buried on the other side. And they left Baba there to do his work. He wasn't to be disturbed. So all four of them took one side and were making sure that no one came in to disturb Baba in doing his work. So Eruch is at the main gate, and to his horror, he sees this procession bringing a dead body to be buried inside the cemetery. And Eruch knows that this will disturb Baba. So he runs down the road at top speed and stops the procession. And that's unheard of. But somehow he managed to do it, and the people there were just shocked that this man that came out of nowhere and is trying to stop their procession. And the wind is blowing away my papers. Just a minute. So Eruch manages to stop them, but they're thinking, well, he must be a madman to have done this. But Eruch goes up to the grieving widow and tries to console her and says, oh, you must be so sad. And this is really difficult for you. And these are your children. And what did he do in his life? And the whole time he's just stalling. But they answer him, and he says, oh, and these are the children, what are their names? And so he's in his mind, he's just thinking of one question after another to hold up the procession. But he seems so sincere that they're thinking, oh, he's not a madman. He's so concerned, he's concerned about the widow and the children, what will happen to them now. And they start having empathy for Eruch. And Baba must have had an incredibly loud clap, because at one time when Eruch was desperate to think of another question, and that he'd thought of one and they're answering it, he hears Baba's clap. In the middle of them answering, he just turns around and runs off, and they go, oh, he was a madman. And so they, all four of them, come back to Baba, roll up his bedding roll. And as they're departing the cemetery, the procession come with the man that had died. And Baba, in his innocent way, he says, "Oh, Eruch, who's this? What's happening?" And so Eruch can tell Baba all about this man, many details. And Baba comments, he says, "You don't know how fortunate he is to have, as he's being buried, to have my Nazar, my sight on him. This is a great fortune for him." Okay, that's the Christian cemetery.
Okay.
So I guess we go on to the Aurangabad
Aurangabad.
fort. Which Margie, Izzy, and Ellie and me were at, as you can see in the photographs, last November, the November before, a year ago. So the Aurangabad fort is one of the biggest forts in India. And it was built by the Hindus. And it was commissioned in 1187. And it was one of the Yadav kings that was his capital for a time. And they took great effort to make it so that it could never be conquered. So they say there are 7 levels of defenses that protect the fort, including a moat. And they have these big wooden gates, but they put what they call elephant spikes. They're like knobs with sharp points on the doors of the fort, so the elephants couldn't break down the gate. And interestingly, the door of the samadhi has those little elephant knobs. I was always curious about it. I've never found out what they were thinking when they put them on, but if you notice the door, you'll see them there, tiny versions. And so they had all these defenses, and including narrow passages, so a big army, couldn't get in, and they had a moat and a dark passage where they could pour boiling oil on you. And they actually, I mean, incredible labor. They actually sheared the sides, because in the middle of the fort there's this hill that's very high. So they were defending that area where the king would live with his family. So they sheared the sides of this solid rock. Because they claim, even during the time of Shivaji, they had these monitor lizards that could scale forts, and the soldiers would. It's hard to believe, but they claimed that they had attached a rope to the monitor lizard, and then they get pulled up and can get up to the top of a fort that way. So they scaled the sides of this fort, so they couldn't even do that. So they're being very clever, but the way the Muslims, when they were invading the fort, they just bribed the guards and conquered the fort. And Eruch says that Baba went into the fort. Now you're seeing this pink tower. It's called the Victory Tower. And Eruch says that Baba went there many times. And then if you climb the steep hill all the way to the top, which the 3 girls managed to do, I only made it halfway a year ago. I had to wait for them to come back. And there's a beautiful view and a brass cannon up there. And Baba had gone all the way once. And on the way to the steep part, on the side, there's a cave. And there's a perfect master named Janardhan that used that cave. So I'm always impressed by that place, because a lot of places, like a fort, where there's battles and bloodshed, and those impressions impregnate the whole atmosphere. And there's a little bit of darkness. But I think because Baba went there so many times, he cleared the atmosphere, and it's like going to a park. It's a very light feeling when you're there. And anything else about that? Oh yes, this is important. So up in Delhi and in Delhi in 1327, the emperor at the time, he decided that he wanted to make this fort his capital. So he ordered all of the inhabitants of Delhi to shift, to move down to this fort in the Deccan. And along, the poor people that had to walk and weren't prepared, that many thousands of people died along the way. But eventually he established it as his capital. And some of the people that were in Delhi at the time were Sufis. And Nizamuddin Chisti is a famous perfect master of those days. And his disciple, Zarzari Zarbash, who also attained God realization. So they were, Zarzari and his followers were ordered to go down to the Deccan. And they were forced to go down there. But they actually liked it, that area. But this area is known for being a drought-prone area. So there was lack of water and facilities. And so after 17 years, the emperor ordered everybody back to Delhi. And many thousands of people again died along the way. But the Sufis decided to not go back to Delhi and settle near there in a city called Kuldabad. And so they took up residence there and had all their disciples, and all of that was going on at that time because they were forced to come down here to the Deccan. Okay, I think that's the fort.
Yeah. You want to talk about the Ellora caves, or should I just go on to the cave 10?
Yeah, I'll give a little general information about the Ellora caves. So one of the features of what's called the Deccan Plateau, which is the biggest geological formation in India that goes for thousands and thousands of square miles, north and south, east and west of Meherabad. And one of the features of the Deccan is that it's this basalt rock that goes, solid basalt rock that goes down hundreds and hundreds of feet. So I always imagine that in the ancient past, that this must have been a very fiery place if there was all these volcanoes that created all this basalt rock. And even the stone that's used for the samadhi is basalt. So in this place that was chosen, that became known as Ellora, there's an escarpment of this basalt rock. And from about the 600s sometime, some of the local kings that were Buddhists decided to make these caves devoted to Buddhism and to Buddha. And then later Hindus came and they made more caves. And then finally, this is all continuous on this same escarpment. And finally the Jains came and made 5 caves at the end. So the first 1 through 12 caves are all Buddha caves. The 13 through 29 are Hindu caves, and the last 5 are Jain caves. And then if you go above the escarpment, there's this valley. And you can actually walk up from the caves in about 15 minutes to this valley. And that's where the Sufis settled. And Eruch says that in this little valley, there's 1,400 saintly personages buried. So it has a special atmosphere, and Baba liked it very much. And another thing that Eruch pointed out, he said that in those early days, that where the caves are in that fort was a north-south trade route. And so if you can imagine that there were hundreds, if not thousands of workers working and on these caves they worked on the caves from 600 to 1100. So during a period of about 500 years, there was a whole community of people living there, and artists and amazing architects that made the plans for the caves and all that. And so some of these traders would stop off, for the night because they could get food and a safe place to rest. And also up in the Valley of the Saints, there was the dargahs of these saints and perfect masters. So they would stop there and have a place to stay for the night. But some of them were so attracted by the atmosphere that they forgot about being merchants and joined in the effort. So when I take people to the caves, I usually just focus on the best examples of each different religion. So there's the Buddha cave, which is cave number 10. There's the Kailash cave, which is number 16. And there's the Jain cave, which is the last 5. And so my understanding is that Baba's favorite cave was the Buddha cave. And maybe you can show the Buddha cave now, please. There we are. You can even see me and Billy and Pam. And there's Eruch leading the tour, one of his tours. One of the stories I love about Eruch is when he would give these tours, there's all these young, mostly Westerners, pilgrims, and he'd fill up a bus with them, and they start really early in the morning. And in the recorded tour that he gave with Dara, it doesn't even include some of the places. He would also take them to special places in Aurangabad on top of that. So at the end of the day, all of these young pilgrims would be beat, and Eruch would still be full of life and energy. So Baba liked the caves, and I think one of the reasons he appreciated them was the devotion that was put in to the work as they were doing it, and the beauty of what they did, the art. As Baba says, art can uplift the soul if it's looked at in the right way. So Eruch says that Baba would actually sometimes be like a tour guide when the Westerners were with him and show them the caves and all that. But other time he would come with his mandali and he'd visit the different caves and do his work, however he did it. And when they were finished with his work, they would come to cave number 10 to rest. And if you've ever been in the cave, it has incredible acoustics. And so they would rest in there, and maybe someone would sing and tell jokes and just relax. But Eruch said that whenever they would leave, Baba would have the mandali circumambulate the Buddha that you can see in the photograph to pay their respect. And this cave is unusual because usually you don't have the Buddha and a stupa. So the stupa is the dome behind the image of the Buddha. And Eruch said a real stupa has something of Buddha in it. So a hair of Buddha, a tooth, a fingernail, something like that. And Eruch intimated that this was a real stupa. And so the image of Buddha is the personal aspect of God. And the stupa represents the all-pervading, omniscient God. And it's unusual to have them both in the same place. And then I remember Meru told me that she and Mani were, and Mani would tell this story also. They were in the cave, Buddha cave, with Baba one time. And Baba pointed to himself and says, I am Buddha. And Mani had this transcendental experience where I am Buddha. I am Buddha, I am Buddha, I am Buddha, was just filling the whole space. And it was just going bigger and bigger and bigger until it was going out to the whole universe. Baba said, I am Buddha. And she had the experience. I don't think Meru did, but she was there at the same time. Okay, that's cave 10, the Buddha cave. We can go on to the Kailash.
I've got two sets of pictures for these, so just let me know when you want me to change it.
Okay. Yeah, this is good to start with because you see the overall, although it looks miniature, it's actually the biggest monolith in the world. They had to remove 200,000 tons of rock to create this. It was built as a temple to Shiva. And you can imagine that there was they just had hammers and picks to do this work. It's quite impressive. And Eruch says that they have guides that will tell the stories, because when you go in this Kailash temple, there's these panels that have stories from the mythology of Shiva and Parvati. And Baba would actually hire this one guide because he was a good storyteller, and he would tell the stories behind what the panels represented. And he didn't realize who he was telling the stories to, but Baba appreciated him. And what else? Oh, there's another traditional story. This is one of the stories I think that the guide told Baba, was that at that time, this king that was sponsoring this cave, previous to that, his queen, who was from Nepal, was very depressed because she loved Mount Kailash, the snow-covered Mount Kailash that's considered sacred by many. And so she was in this hot, dry, dusty place in the Deccan with her king, but she was missing Kailash. So she got so depressed, she stopped eating. So the king was worried and asked, what's wrong? And she said, oh, I just don't want to go on living, and I'm missing my Kailash so much. So the story goes that the king said, no, I'll make Kailash for you here. And so when they started carving this cave, the very top of it represents Mount Kailash. And incredibly, whoever designed this must have been spiritually advanced, because they designed the whole structure, the whole temple. And they started from the top and had to work down to carve it. It was kind of like upside down in your mind when you had to imagine, and make the drawings for it. And yeah, that's good. So there's more images of Kailash, beautiful artwork. And the whole outside of the temple was actually painted with earth pigments. And you can still see some of the remains of the paint that was there. And inside, when you go inside the Shiva temple, there's frescoes on the ceilings. There's a few remaining, but the whole place was painted on the outside and on the inside also. So Eruch would take, and there's this outside, you could call it a corridor, walkway, alleyway, where you can walk around the whole outside. You're looking at the temple as you walk around, and there's these panels of Parvati and Shiva, and Eruch would tell some of the stories. But I never learned those stories. But at one point, you're looking up at the temple, and in his group, there were all these young Westerners. So they would ask interesting questions. So I remember he was asked by one of the Baba lovers, Western Baba lovers, Eruch, we're looking at the outside of this. You said it's one of the 12 sacred Shiva temples in India. And we're looking on the outside of the temple, and there's couples copulating. How is that? If we were to put images like that in our churches, we'd call it pornography. So Eruch very resourcefully said, well, that represents the world that you leave behind when you enter the inner life, the inner sanctum. And that was a beautiful explanation of Eruch. So then in this picture on the right with the gold color, that's the inner part of the temple. And that doorway at the end, there's a very large Shiva lingam. And that's the inner sanctum. And the Shiva lingam represents the phallus of Shiva. And around the lingam is the yoni, which is the vagina. And Eruch, again, he beautifully explains, that Baba explained to him, that it wasn't that the ancient Hindus were worshiping the genitalia of mankind, but the real meditation is, or the Shiva lingam represents creation, that everything came out of Shiva, the creator. Or Shiva wasn't the creator, but anyway, in mythology. But anyway, it represents the creation and creative energies that creates this creation, which is duality. And so it represents all of duality, what's black and white, and all the male, female, all the opposites. And that the real meditation is to go beyond duality. But he said, unfortunately, the Hindus latch on to the rites and rituals. So, they have all these rituals that they do with the Shiva lingam. Women come because they want to have children and get blessings and et cetera, and they pour ghee and yogurt on it and have all these rites and rituals. But Baba explained to Eruch that the real meditation is to go beyond duality. And there's a beautiful carved, you could call it a window without glass, in one of the upper rooms, because it's 2 stories, this temple. And you can look out on the whole lower part of that area of the caves. And Baba liked to go there and rest and look at the view when he was there.
Oh, here, I have that. I actually have that picture of Baba sitting there. One second. Right here.
That's not actually that's a different place, but it
Oh, okay,
would be, because he was looking out at what are now lawns and neem trees and all that. But that's probably Baba in the Kailash cave at the time.
So should we go?
Yeah, so
on
now we can go on to the Jain caves.
Okay. Biff, with this one, I've got 2 sets of pictures too. So just let me know when you want me to change.
Right. Okay, so these are the Jain caves, and many people say that the artwork is even finer in these caves than the Hindu caves. And again, they have frescoes on the ceiling, so you see an example of that with an image surrounded by cobras. And Eruch said that the inspiration for Jainism was Mahavir, who was he was a perfect master and a contemporary of Buddha. And he was famous for meditating in the jungle and harming nothing. So ants and scorpions would crawl in his body and he would just let them. Snakes would crawl over his feet. And he would never harm anything. And also, he was such a renunciate that he didn't wear clothes. So he would walk everywhere naked, and walking through villages, kids would tease him, and he wasn't bothered or concerned. And Balna too, in his book Glimpses, he said during the new life in that time when Baba was there in the Valley of the Saints with the 4 companions, he went to one of these caves to do his work. And Balna too surmises that Baba picked that cave and the atmosphere created by Mahavir, the perfect master, because he represented the perfect renunciate, that he renounced absolutely everything to be one with God. Okay, I think that's the Jain cave.
Biff, what I'm thinking might be best is I've got Sita's baths next, but then maybe we do Valley of the Saints next week, just because it's getting late and I don't want you to, like, there's so much in the Valley of the Saints. Would that work?
We can, yeah, sure. So
Okay.
are we ending now or we're going up to Sita's bath?
The Sita's baths.
Okay. So this is a nice little part of the trip that many people that come to the Laura Caves don't know about. So there's by cave number 29, which is the last Hindu cave, when there's good rains, there's a beautiful waterfall. And if you follow the stream that feeds the waterfall, there's these beautiful pools of water just carved out of solid rock. And you can see L.A. Margie and Izzy all sitting next to some of the pools up there. So I tell people these days I prefer to take 2 days to do the trip. We spend the night. There's a place where you can stay and have breakfast and look up at the caves. But before breakfast, I like to go on this hike up to, it's known as Sita's Baths, because they say that Ram and Sita were there 5,000 years ago and that she would bathe in these pools of water. That's a tradition. And then along the sides of the caves are little caves that had in the past must have been used by monks that would meditate and yeah, there's more pictures. It's very quiet. Not many people know about it, so it's beautiful just to walk up there early in the morning and see this flowing water, and there's a very peaceful atmosphere. Nice. That's it then.
Well, thank you, Bif.
My pleasure.
This has been amazing. I feel like I've been transported there. I guess I will, Biff, if you're okay with it, I'll open it up for questions if anybody has any. About anybody have any questions from that?
Biff, you're incredible. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Well-
that was a great tour. Thanks.
It's only
Really.
half over.
I'm glad you enjoyed
It
it.
was wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It was like an
Yeah,
evening at Disneyland.
Well, a spiritual Disneyland, I hope,
Yes, thank you.
because I always love telling the Baba stories because it just, of course, reminds us of Baba, who he was and what he did for us.
Josh, you got a question?
Yes, I do. Yeah, thanks, Biff. Amazing. I was wondering on what your perceptions were with those Pandora's box jars with the ash, the Mananash ash in it. Like obviously your guesses as towards what we should do in the future to make sure they don't get opened. I remember telling Devana that we should launch them into space, but I think she thought that was a bad idea. But I'm
Yeah,
interested to hear what you think.
Baba said they should never be disturbed, so I think if we launch them into space, it would disturb it. They've made this, Ted designed this beautiful archives building, and it has an inner sanctum that's very secure. And I'm guessing, and I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that they'll be stored there. So, just like Baba has his Kamali coat that he wore for continuously, I don't know, 7-9 years. And then he said this coat should always remain here. It should never leave India. So I think Meherabad's the best place for it. And the Baba lovers in the future will just have to make sure that it's all secure and that they follow Baba's wish.
Awesome. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much.
Although
Biff, and
I just for Josh's entertainment, they talked about if you can make duplicates of things that should be saved for the future of Babas, they should be put in as many different places because you never know if there's going to be an earthquake or a flood or something like that. So my suggestion is they should send some of the stuff to the moon. So.
I think that's a good idea, actually.
Okay, so you can write a letter to NASA and see if and Elon Musk and see if they agree with you.
Biff, well, thank you so much. And just so you guys know, there's another part of the tour, which is the Valley of the Saints, but there's so much in the Valley of the Saints that we're going to pick it up next week. So if you enjoyed this, come back and get the rest of that.
Yes.
Anything else?
Yes.
Well, great.
Thank
Biff,
you,
thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Margie. Thank you.
Thank you,
Biff.
Biff.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Very interesting.
Well, thank you.
Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai.
Meherabad ki jai.
Avatar
Yes,
Meher
yes,
Baba
yes.
Ki Jai.
Avatar Meher
Avatar
Baba
Meher Baba
Ki
Ki Jai.
Jai.
Yes, yes, yes.